Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam, and today, with the help of scholars Lisandro Abadie and Team Braithwaite, we will talk about countertenors. In the 20th century, as part of the early music revival, a neglected voice type re-entered the concert stage: the solo countertenor, a male voice which typically uses the falsetto register for the entirety of his range. In this episode, we will compare the place of the countertenor voice in history with its role in the performance of early music today. We will do so by addressing 7 frequently asked questions. But first, we must go through the basics of voice types. Let's start. Nowadays, the 4 most common voice types are as follows: 2 female, 1 high and 1 low, soprano and alto, and 2 male, which are roughly 1 octave lower than female voices, also 1 high and 1 low, tenor and bass. Every healthy voice is capable of producing sounds using broadly 2 mechanisms, a low one and a high one. The lower one is often called chest voice, and is typically the voice we use when speaking. Ah. The higher one is often called falsetto. Ah. The term head voice is used by some as a synonym of falsetto, but by others to describe other phenomena in the human voice. In the context of female voices, the term falsetto is highly controversial. At any rate, through the use of falsetto, singers can extend their range upwards. Thus, male voices are able to sing many of the notes typically associated with female voices. Nowadays, when a male singer uses mainly his falsetto register, covering more or less the range of a modern female alto, he is often referred to as a countertenor. This voice type is the focus of this episode. These are the basic voice types as we define them nowadays, but historically, systems of categorization were often very different. Moreover, there were kinds of singers other than these who were regularly active in music, namely boys and castrati. These voice types, each with their own unique tone, are more or less equivalent to female singers in range. Boys had high voices, which is typical before puberty, and castrati kept their high voices into adulthood, since they were artificially deprived of their puberty in a horrifically cruel way. The presence of these high male singers allowed for the performance of repertoire requiring the entire gamut in situations where female voices were often forbidden or absent. Understanding historical voice types is crucial for understanding the role of countertenors in historical contexts. The wide variety of modern vocal classifications, based on both scientific and musical opinions, makes the task of understanding historical sources often very difficult. Here are some of the main challenges. One of the first confusing things is that nowadays we tend to refer to voice types and the names of the musical parts using similar terminology. A soprano sings the soprano part, and a tenor sings the tenor part, etc. But historically, voice types were frequently less defined, and the names of musical parts often varied. For example, the altus part, the part that is in between the uppermost part and the tenor, was sometimes called literally contratenor or countertenor. Does this mean that he who sang it was a countertenor? Even in cases where singers were referred to according to the part they sang, this does not tell us whether this countertenor is a countertenor according to our definition today. There is in fact a lot of evidence suggesting that those who sang these altus or contratenor parts before the 18th century were often what we would now define as high tenors, male singers who mainly used their chest voice. Another challenge in the search for the historical countertenor is the nature of the physiological descriptions found in historical sources. Often, it's hard for us to understand whether the sources describe falsetto singing or perhaps something else. Thus, there is sometimes a degree of conjecture involved, and the fact that historical terminology can be different from our own makes it even harder. The last challenge which we will address is the historical context that must be taken into account whenever we approach a source. For example, in late 16th century Italy, many started to favor castrati over boys or countertenors. However, while the castrati were appreciated for their voices, they were disapproved of socially. The act of castration was illegal in Italy, but the Roman Catholic Church encouraged this practice nevertheless by continuing to employ castrati as singers. Thus, it's possible that some records may in fact hide the true nature of some singers by euphemistically describing castrati as falsettists. Now that we have some basic background on this complicated topic, we can dive into 7 frequently asked questions regarding the countertenor voice. Let's see. Question number 1. The term falsetto comes from the word false. Is there something false, not real, or unnatural about falsetto? No. Falsetto is a mechanism which is available to any healthy voice and was used throughout history by all kinds of singers. Question number 2. What part did countertenors sing in Renaissance polyphony? As we mentioned above, the parts called alto, or sometimes literally contratenor, were probably not sung by what we call countertenors, but by voices which we would nowadays describe as high tenors. However, different periods and places often had different preferences as to who sang the uppermost part of a composition. It could have been either boys, castrati, women, or indeed countertenors. In some liturgical contexts, countertenors were considered the best choice, as castrati were rare and expensive, and in some contexts not approved of socially, and boys were not always as reliable and experienced as adult singers. Question number 3. What role did countertenors play in Baroque opera? Actually, they rarely took part in them at all. The superstars of Baroque opera were mostly female singers and castrati, and countertenors were generally not considered to be an appropriate substitute for either. It is worth mentioning that the first major role for an operatic countertenor was most likely written in the 20th century. Question number 4. What role did countertenors have under Bach's direction? Well, who Bach's singers may have been is a terribly complicated issue, which has been debated for decades without any clear conclusions being reached. In many cases, it seems to have been Bach's students in their teens or even early 20s who sang both the soprano and alto parts, perhaps even blurring traditional boundaries between countertenors and boys. There is also evidence of adult countertenors singing soprano parts in German-speaking traditions. All of Buxtehude's soprano soloists, for example, seem to have been adult men, that is, countertenors. Question number 5. Are countertenors a particularly English thing? What role did they play in the performance of English lute songs, the music of Henry Purcell, or the oratorios of Handel? The special connection between the countertenor voice and the English musical tradition was more or less an invention of the 20th century. In fact, there is not much evidence for countertenors taking part in any of the above. Furthermore, it has been suggested that the English choral tradition, in which countertenors typically sing the alto part, has preserved the structure of Renaissance choirs. However, it is likely only from the 19th century that countertenors as we understand them started regularly singing alto parts. Question number 6. Can countertenors also sing lower male voice types? Nowadays, it is mostly the case that countertenors use mainly their falsetto register, and only rarely their chest voice. But historically, this was not necessarily true. There are many examples of singers who performed both high parts using their falsetto, as well as alto, tenor, or bass parts using their chest voice. For example, at the end of the 16th century, both Giovanni Conforto and Giovanni Bovicelli seem to have been soprano countertenors who were famous for their virtuosic diminution technique, but who are also known to have sung other vocal parts. Question number 7. Is the French haute contre connected somehow to countertenors? Haute contre is the French equivalent of the alto part, and was, you guessed it, regularly sung by what we call tenors and not countertenors. We learned from 18th century sources that the French haute contre, unlike their Italian counterparts, were in fact rather loud and often not so refined. This is, interestingly, quite the opposite of the conception of haute contres today, who often tend to sound light and sweet. As you can see, the historical background of the countertenor voice is very complex. Regardless, the revival of the countertenor as a solo voice has diversified the musical language, introducing unconventional sounds which are different from the mainstream voice types of the 20th century, and allowing for a new appreciation of unique and original musical approaches. This was our show about countertenors. We hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks to Lisandro Abadie and Team Braithwaite for sharing their knowledge. If you enjoy early music sources, feel free to support us on Patreon. Comment, share and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.